So it's difficult to overstate how big of a deal it is back in Britain that Huw Edwards, the face of British news, really, the face of BBC News, has now been named as the presenter at the centre of this huge scandal that's been raging in the last week. In that esteem, he's the face of our state occasions, of royal events. He's the man who announced the death of the late Queen. He's wry, he's authoritative, and above all, he's always been trusted. By all accounts, the audiences love him. I know him personally. He's always seemed to be a very stand-up guy. So today's news that he is the presenter behind the BBC sex picture scandal is a huge shock to everyone that knows him, maybe to his family, certainly to millions of people who are used to watching him on the news each night. Probably a shock to his colleagues at the BBC. For the last 5 days, speculation has raged about the man at the heart of the crisis. Tonight, his wife, Vicky Flynn, the television producer with whom he has 5 children, took the courageous decision to end all that speculation. In a statement, she said, "I'm doing this primarily out of concern for his mental well-being and to protect our children. Huw is suffering from serious mental health issues. As is well documented, he's been treated for severe depression in recent years. The events of the last few days have greatly worsened matters. He suffered another serious episode and is now receiving inpatient hospital care where he'll stay for the foreseeable future. Once well enough to do so, he intends to respond to the stories that have been published." She goes on to confirm that Edwards didn't know about any of his claims until last week. She made a call for privacy, and she adds that Huw is deeply sorry that so many colleagues had been impacted by the speculation. And that's a key point. The speculation was becoming completely unsustainable. Many other male BBC presenters were being shamed and vilified on social media for something they had nothing to do with and had to, in some cases, publicly deny their involvement. Viewers were bound to notice that Huw Edwards had vanished overnight from the nightly news bulletins. Now, clearly, Huw Edwards is now in a very serious situation. He probably feels like he's losing everything. Whatever the outcome of the investigations, it would be inhuman not to think about the impact of all this on him, on his family, on his mental health. All of those are important things to consider now. But now we can talk freely about who this is. It should also be clearer why it's been such a big story. The Met Police says it has no evidence of criminality, but what remains are allegations about a potentially serious abuse of power by a household name paid handsomely from the public purse. Accused originally of paying tens of thousands of pounds to a teenager with drug problems for indecent images. More claims about his behaviour have followed from 3 other people so far, including allegations made not just to The Sun, but directly to the BBC. And the way the BBC has managed this complaint remains a matter of legitimate public interest and concern. We shouldn't forget the other people involved in this story, because there are a lot. Well, I'm joined now by my pack, the best-selling author of War of the West and columnist Douglas Murray, former Conservative MP Louise Mensch, and the multimillionaire investor, one of the sharks on the American reality tank, Kevin O'Leary. The former executive at Channel 5 and also worked at the BBC, David Elstein. But first, let me start by talking to the former BBC political correspondent and current Times radio presenter, Carole Walker. Carole, thank you so much for joining me. This is an unbelievably complex and difficult story. It has been from the start, because I'm sure you, like me, and most people in the media very quickly discovered that it was Huw Edwards. But that name was not being made public, and as a result, there was this feeding frenzy of speculation driven by social media about who this could be. That was, of course, very damaging to all those concerned. But as somebody who knows Huw Edwards well, what is your reaction to all this turn of events today? The police saying that they found no evidence on that initial story of any crime being committed. And secondly, his wife's decision to go public in naming him and revealing he's having these serious mental health issues in hospital.
Well, I think, to be honest, Piers, my first thoughts are for Huw's family and for Huw himself. He's clearly had a very serious mental health problem. He is being treated in hospital for that. And it must have been an unbelievably difficult time for his wife and the rest of his family. She's clearly taken the decision that she had to speak out tonight. That can't have been easy. And I think that really we do have to respect and understand why she's now asking for some time for the rest of the family to try and ensure that he gets the right treatment and to get on with their own lives. I think the other important thing to say here, Piers, is that, of course, none of the allegations about Huw has actually been proven or established beyond any doubt. The police have now said that they are not going to carry out any sort of investigation. And I think that what we're left with here is, though there are clearly some questions about how the BBC may have handled this, it does underline the complexity of all of this. You know, I worked alongside Huw when he was a rising star as a political correspondent, one of a number of very ambitious and talented BBC figures, including some of those like Jeremy Vine, who found themselves unfairly targeted. And I think that it does also just highlight that issue of how people who are such huge public figures can also then find themselves targets, not just perhaps of some justified complaints, but also of such huge amounts of speculation and rumours, as we've seen over the past few days swirling around on social media.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I don't disagree with any of that. All I would say, though, is there seems to be a sort of growing criticism of the way the Sun has handled this. But to be clear, they didn't name him to start with, and they didn't say that what he'd done was a criminal act. That was others, actually, that were commenting on this potentially straying into the area of criminality. Also, significantly, the BBC themselves have also been exposing their own stories and their own investigation into Huw Edwards' alleged inappropriate conduct. And in fact, today I think there were more revelations from the BBC about his allegedly inappropriate behaviour towards colleagues. So it's not just a tabloid or a Sun-driven scandal in that sense. You've actually had the BBC themselves having journalists investigating and finding what they believe to be, because they've reported it, to be evidence of inappropriate conduct. Where does that leave Huw Edwards, do you think, in terms of his future at the BBC? And what do you feel about the BBC actually in that situation, investigating him in that way?
Well, look, I actually think that the BBC has done a pretty good job on reporting a story which is about one of its own very senior presenters. I think anyone who has watched the BBC coverage over the past few days must really accept and acknowledge that they've managed to treat this as another story. I have worked at the BBC when there are stories about the BBC. I know how difficult it is, but I know that it's also a point of pride for the BBC that its journalists try to set aside the fact that it is one of their own that they're talking about and to treat this as another news story. Now, you and I both now work for competitors, but we'll know what the challenges are in the journalism of this sort of thing. So I think Tim Davie himself, the Director General, has acknowledged that perhaps they need to look again at their complaints process, at the procedures when a complaint against a senior figure is red flagged as something that's very serious. I think there are perhaps some legitimate questions about whether they moved swiftly enough, but you have to balance that against the fact that there are huge numbers of complaints made every week about BBC figures.
Well, there are. And look, I think just to pick you up on that, there are, but I don't think there would be many complaints of this severity against the face of BBC News, would be my counter to that. I still think it's ridiculous. The BBC, in 7 weeks after this was reported to them by the family directly about their concerns about what was happening with their son, that it took 7 weeks and just one standard email and one phone call that didn't get connected. That was their attempt at following up what was obviously on the face of it, potentially extremely serious charges, as indeed Tim Davie, the Director General of the BBC, has conceded they were. So I wouldn't necessarily go along, I think, with your defence of the way the BBC handled it. I actually think it's been a little bit shambolic. But
can I just pick you up on that point, Piers? Yeah. Because you should also bear in mind that the young person at the centre of the very first allegation, the allegation that Huw Edwards, as we now know it is, had paid money to someone for explicit images, the young person at the centre of that said the claims that were made and reported in The Sun about this were rubbish, and that there had been nothing illegal or improper that had taken place. So there are also two sides to that, and neither you nor I nor anyone else knows the truth of that at the moment.
Yeah, I don't have any inside knowledge of what The Sun has in terms of evidence, but what I do know is this young man is clearly pretty damaged. He's apparently a crack cocaine addict, so I'm not entirely sure that we should take everything he may be saying after this as you know. I'd love to have him on the programme and talk about it, but I don't think he can. So I think it's complicated.